Right.
If it's not profitable, or if it's injurious to another brother, I'll avoid that. But it's going to be governed by biblical principles or by
Yeah.
what's being revealed.
Right.
It's not military.
Everything comes down to the fact of whether it's going to cause someone to sin or you yourself sin. Like he was saying that Paul's following the law of Christ. There's plenty of things in the governmental law that are acceptable, but that doesn't mean we have to do them.
Says we're sanctified, set apart.
We're set apart from those things.
His attitude here, in all respects, was to do God's will.
Yeah, to do God's will, right? His attitude.
Scott, this is another point where context is important. If all you do is pull that verse out of context, all things are lawful for me. Well, we know not all things are lawful for us. You have to go back a verse
Right.
or two, and he just goes through this big long list of things that if you do these things, you're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. Okay, which means they're not lawful for us. Okay, so we have to take it in context. I think maybe a better way to look at that verse is all things that are lawful for me might not be expedient.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But either way, apparently the Corinthians were using excuses to do things. And what those excuses were, I don't know exactly, but apparently they were using excuses to entertain these acts.
There's about 10 of them there that are named. 10 is-
Right. Those particular things, perhaps they were falling back into some of these things and asked Paul how to deal with that, or what do we do? We don't know exactly because we don't have that particular letter. We can just go on what Paul tells us in these letters. But they must have been using these things as an excuse that, well, hey, it's legal, then I should be able to do it. Just like abortion in America today is legal, but it goes against the law of Christ. So we cannot partake in that. Well, and just like today, we always try to find excuses. I mean, we still do it. It's not just the Corinthians. Not all Christians, but many Christians still try to find excuses to do things that are not expedient. Okay, verse 13. Foods for the stomach, and the stomach is the stomach for foods. But God will destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Paul's point here is the body was not created for sin. The body will have physical needs, but must only be used for things approved by God. It's like the abortion issue. Perfectly legal in America to do that. But that's not what God would have. So that would go against God. And the things that we do with the body, of course, are important. The way we treat the body. Now, of course, this specific instance, he says, the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Now, you remember, just a little bit ago, we talked about, well, first you have that list, and before that, we talked about the adulterous situation, and he's touching on those things again. It says in verse 14, and God both raised up the Lord, and will also raise us up by his power. Just as Jesus was raised physically from the grave, we will be raised as well. And our bodies, once we are raised as Christians, we will be pure. We should use our bodies for pure things and not things of the world, not activities that are fun, but might go against what Christ would have us to do. Any sinful act, our bodies should not be wasted on sinful acts because we are the temple of the Lord. We don't have shiny gold on. We don't have decorations and everything, but we are where Christ lives. He goes on to verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? Certainly not. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot is one body with her? For the two, he says, shall become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. So flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does outside the body, every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in body and in your spirit, which are God's. If you remember in Galatians chapter 2 at verse 20, Paul reminds us that we have been crucified with Christ. And it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So we are that temple. And he says, in the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. It's no longer me that needs to get pleasure out of this body. It's the Lord who needs to shine. And I need to use my body so people will see the Lord. Our bodies are the temple of the Lord. He lives in us, and we can't defile that. Just like when somebody would defile the temple, it was a bad thing. We are the temple now. There's not use for sacred buildings anymore because we are where the Lord lives. And we can't do anything in this world that goes against God. Furthermore, nothing in this world is ours. It's all God's. And the body should be used for good things, for godly things.
In Matthew 4:4, it says, Jesus says that man cannot live by bread alone.
That's right.
We have all this other things to consider, don't we?
Yep. We have to understand that the body is important because what we use the body for must be the way that God intended us to use that. However, it goes a lot further than the body. If we are not spiritual, if we are not godly, then we're wasting our bodies. We as Christians are to be godly, therefore using our bodies to glorify God. And if we do not do that, then we are misusing something that God gave us. We're not being good stewards. And many people are going to say, well, then why do you eat so much? You're destroying your body. I had this conversation more than once, as you may imagine. There was a discussion concerning homosexuality that I didn't mean for it to be a discussion. Just a comment was made. And boy, did somebody tear me down talking about if someone who's a homosexual can't go to heaven, and you can't either because you're fat. They didn't say it exactly like that. They said something about gluttony is a sin too. That's just people who don't understand what things mean.
The degree of it.
Yeah, right. And that's just their way to fight back. But as Christians, we must treat the body fairly. We must treat it good. I don't believe it's. It's very apparent in the scriptures that we can't misuse the body. We can't put things into our body that will destroy the body. We can't alter our minds with anything. We can't get joy out of an altered mind and not being in control of our bodies. Because when we're not in control of our bodies, then we will do anything. That being said, what about medications? Well, those are controlled situations. The doctor is controlling what we put in there, and the doctor tells us to take this much and you'll be all right. Now, when somebody takes 3 or 4 extras, they're not all right. When some crushes it up and snorts it up their nose, they're not all right. But when we're doing things like that for medical purposes, they're controlled. But when we're just willy-nilly putting things into our body for pleasure, we're going against what God tells us to do.
When I ate a nice fat steak, it sort of feels like I'm treating my body.
Right? A steak would make you think that. but it's not the best thing for your body, is it?
Moderation.
Moderation, right.
But you know what, I know different people that are very, very heavy, very big, they don't eat much.
Well, see, and
You can't go-
that's the way people don't understand it. Just because someone is bigger doesn't mean they put food above everything else, and that's what gluttony is, putting food above everything else. There may be somebody who puts food above everything else and is as skinny as a rail. Okay, it's not about the fatness, it's about the attitude of putting something before God.
Just how people see things.
Right. It's how people want to use excuses most of the time. Okay, anything else on chapter 6? All right, we will move on to chapter 7. And we will start with verse 1. Now concerning the things which you wrote to me, he's reminding us here that they wrote a letter asking questions and talking about things. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Apparently there was issues going on here. Paul needed to answer their concerns. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due to her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So we're talking about sexual immorality here. He talks about the husband and the wife relationship. It is the duty of the husband and the wife to show the proper affection to each other. It's something that God has given us. Paul says the sexual relation should not be withheld from your partner, your husband or wife, and unless it's for a specific time that both have agreed upon to give attention to God. And fasting and prayer is used here. But don't withhold it too long, because that could lead to a fornication issue or an adulterous relationship.
Satan is there in all of it.
Oh, it's all Satan. We wouldn't have any of this if it weren't for having battled him. This also implies, though, that a sexual relation is not just for procreation. You know, many people think it's just for procreation, for children to be born, and it's often looked upon as something wrong. But between a husband and a wife, it's perfectly fine. It's not just for procreation, and the refusal of one to cohabit is considered the fraud he's also talking about here. Many people will use the excuse of, well, we have children together, so we need to live together, or whatever the case may be in that. But that's not the case. This is for a husband and his wife, the wife and the husband, and they are to use those things properly, just like anything else that God gives us. They've got to be done properly. Choices are very important, but the husband does not own his body in this situation. The wife does not own her body. It's a consensual situation, and these needs must be met, because if they're not met, it could lead to sin. Now, down in later in chapter 8 and on into verse 9, we'll talk, or chapter 8 and 9, we'll talk a little bit about causing stumbling blocks. But this would be a way to cause a stumbling block for our husband or wife, if we keep things like that from them. But then he says in verse 6, but I say this as a concession, not a commandment. So the married couple's celibacy and refraining from the cohabiting, they weren't mandatory, the husband and wife, but they were allowable. They did not have to separate for a period of time. But if they needed to, it was allowed, as long as they were both in agreement. Of course, the separation is, God does not want the husband and wife to be separated for longer than they need to for his sake. And so not living together would be wrong as a husband and wife, especially because of this particular situation here. He says, "For I wish all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." So Paul says he wishes that everybody could remain unmarried. He wishes everybody had the ability to control themselves like he can. Paul doesn't sit back and say, boy, I wish everybody was unmarried, because if everybody was unmarried, then it would be a sin for them to procreate. So that would stop people. And so Paul's not saying don't get married. He just wishes that everybody could control themselves like he can.
It lets us know that Paul wasn't married.
Right.
There's a question every now and then.
Well, it's obvious that he was. I don't even know why people question it, but
What's implied there is so that they could devote more service to God.
right. His point in wishing that people could control themselves is because they would have more time for God. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them to remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So if the unmarried or the widows or widowers have enough self-control, it's okay for you to remain unmarried. Paul says do that, if at all possible. But if there's no self-control, then get married. Don't sin instead of getting married, of course, in a proper marriage situation. He says, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. So understand that Paul's stating here that there are no direct words from Christ that make the point that he's making here. But we have to remember that Paul is an inspired writer. And what is written came from God. Just because Christ didn't say it, just because the Lord did not say it, does not mean that it's not an inspired statement. But Paul says here, a wife is not to depart from her husband. There's no reason that a husband and wife should separate other than that short period in agreement that they they depart to come to the Lord in prayer and fasting. So, well, verse 11, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. So, since the only reason for divorce is adultery, according to Jesus, Paul is probably referring to that instance here. A wife should not depart from her husband. If she does, if there's adultery, and she does depart from her husband, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband.
Broader now than fornication, which would include adultery.
Fornication, yes, right. Any fornication, adultery is just part of fornication. You're right. So any type of fornication, but that's the only reason that a wife or husband should depart from the other. And Paul, again, he's throwing in, and if you can remain unmarried, do it. But you don't have to. Or be reconciled to your husband. And it says the husband is not to divorce the wife. So it's Paul's advice here for the innocent party to remain single or to reconcile to the original partner because of, if they remain unmarried, they will have more time to serve God. But if they can't do that, then they need to reconcile so they don't burn with that passion. In verse 12, but to the rest, not the Lord, not the Lord say, if a brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. This is a matter of mixed marriages at this point, Christian and non-Christian. Not that Christians were marrying non-Christians, but that one of them was converted after the marriage. So you have perhaps two Jews, one was converted to Christianity. Just because that happens does not mean you have to leave your spouse. This does not give the Christian the right to go out and marry someone who's not a Christian. And I say that because many times I've heard this passage used. It's not saying, hey, you can. It's definitely not wise to do that because of the things that can happen. Not saying good things can't come from it, but just like Paul, remaining unmarried, could control himself, things react and people react in different ways. So anyway, if you are converted, he's saying here, and your husband or your wife is not, if he's willing to live with you, let him live with you. It says, verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now are holy. Paul says the marriage is valid. It doesn't break up the marriage vow because someone becomes a Christian after the marriage. Verse 15, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So if that unbeliever does want to leave the marriage, it's not good, but it's not the fault of the believer. If somebody wants, if they wanted to leave that marriage based upon the fact that they became a Christian, that does not give reason for remarriage, however, just because the unbelieving or the non-Christian wants to leave. If the unbeliever would remarry, then that would constitute adultery, and then the believer would be free to remarry if he or she chose to. Verse 16, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Perhaps them staying together would be beneficial. Maybe the unbeliever would be converted. So it's best to stay together, but if the unbeliever wants to leave, the believer is not under bondage. They're still under the marriage relationship, but it's not their fault. They won't be held accountable in judgment because someone left. Because they left because their partner became a Christian. So it's good to stay together because maybe you could convert the other. And we've seen it happen a lot of times. Again, that doesn't give us authority to go out and find an unbeliever and say, I'm going to convert them. Because it doesn't always happen. But God has distributed to each one, as the Lord called to each one, so let him walk, and so I ordain in all the churches. In other words, whatever the case may be, the believer must remain in the proper relationship with God, no matter what happens. The marriage relationship is important, but the marriage relationship does not come before God. A good Christian will do their best to treat their spouse as God would want them to treat their spouse. Doesn't mean that they're going to be perfect at it, but they should strive to do that. Not letting too many things come before the family other than God, or the spouse other than God. He says, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. Christianity was first, and the marriage is after that. However, a marriage for the Christian has to be done, well, marriage for anybody, needs to be done the way God tells you to do it. So if you're not doing that right, you have failed God. Not only have you failed your spouse, but you failed God. So the marriage relationship is important. They were asking about it, apparently. There were problems, and Paul explained to them that it's husband and wife for life, not husband and wife until I decide I want somebody else. And of course, the only reason for that would be that adultery, which was not referenced here specifically, except back down in verse 13 or something, when he talks about leaving for a moment but coming back, being reconciled. Okay, we will pick up with verse 18 next week.